All right, we are live, and now we're going to record in three, two. Welcome to another episode of Million Dollar Stories, where we get to interview authors from all over the world. As you guys know, I'm a major patriot. I love capitalism, and a word that usually scares me is globalization. And so we have an individual who has done a lot of research on it. And the book that we're talking about today is called Six Faces of Globalization: Who Wins, Who Loses, and Why It Matters. And the author, Nicholas Lamp, is here with us. Thanks so much for being here, sir.
It's my pleasure.
Well, let's start off with the genesis of the book. All right. So when I hear the words, or when I hear the word, I guess you get a globalist, I think of Trudeau. All right. And I believe you're in Canada, and I think of the WEF, and I think of potentially the Democrat Party. So that's the way I look at it. What made you want to sit down and write this book?
Well, globalization used to be something that people used to support pretty much across the political spectrum. So if you think back to the time before Trump, the Republican Party was actually a heavy booster of globalization. It was more the Democratic Party that it was a bit more skeptical. It was more closely aligned with the labor unions. And but if you go back to the 90s, like think to Bill Clinton, George W.H. Bush, right? They were pretty much all in favor of globalization. It was like after the Cold War ended, it was this big moment where the West felt we had won, like free market capitalism had won, and we were going to conquer the world essentially. And many businesses, American businesses, were on board with that because they saw a lot of export opportunities, investment opportunities, and so that really became the established wisdom that globalization is good. Like we're going to grow the pie. Everybody can get a bigger share as a result. Like that was one of the metaphors, or the other one was like a rising tide will lift all boats. And so, yeah, we call that in the book, we call it the establishment narrative, right? That
Yeah.
globalization ultimately is going to make everyone better off. Yeah, there are going to be some losers for some time. Like if you lose your job, that's bad, but you can adjust. You can move to some other place. You can retrain, and ultimately you'll be better off. And also you get all the cheap products. You get all the cheap products from China, right? So that was the story. So what happened around 2015, 2016 is that there was real backlash against that. And of course, the election of Donald Trump is a great example of that. But the truth is, there had been many critiques of globalization that had been around for some time, right? You had critiques from the left who was saying that, look, it's screwing with our labor standards. People who are manufacturing our sneakers in Indonesia, they're being mistreated. It's polluting the environment in other countries. There were people who are saying it's a security threat if we become so dependent on China. We have to be careful. And so what we really try to do in the book is to disentangle all these critiques and say, look, there are different faces. Globalization has different faces. It's a very complex phenomenon. And the basic message of the book is that there's truth in all these perspectives. There's truth in the perspective that, yes, we have access to cheaper products through globalization. Some people get great jobs because of globalization, including people like you. You can reach a global audience, right?
Damn right.
Potentially.
Maybe that's how I look at it. I saw entrepreneurs who are using virtual assistants in different countries, and we're serving clients all over the world. Maybe we're the real globalists, right? That's how we look at it.
Absolutely. I think I mean, the term globalist is a bit problematic because is it someone who benefits from globalization? Is that a globalist? Or is it like some kind of ideology? We don't really use the term globalist in the book because they're clearly they're people who are boosters of globalization, but they're also people like you who maybe don't align with that old establishment, but who are still benefiting from globalization, right? So
Yeah.
it's really we're trying to convey the message. Look, there it has so many sides. Globalization has so many aspects that you have to try to see it from different perspectives.
And I was looking through your book, and I like how you outlined it, and it's like a Rubik's cube, right? That's how you kind of embrace it, right? The six sides. And I thought to myself when I'm looking at it, right? You talk about the establishment. The way I look at globalization, maybe this is the most simple form, the cleanest definition is that it's unelected bodies having control over an entire world population, right? The WHO, the WEF, when it comes to health and economics, right? Those are the two most important pieces. If you have a body of people who have control over a country who were never elected, you have serious problems because all of a sudden that opens up doors for corruption and for individuals to be bought and paid for, which then means you are SOL about doing anything about it except for shutting it down completely. For example, like Donald Trump has proposed. So, is am I right about that? Is that how many people look at globalization?
I would say that's one critique. The concern about loss of sovereignty is one critique, which animated, for example, the Brexit movement in the United Kingdom. But what we would say, and I should say a bit about my background, I'm an international lawyer by training, and my co-author is as well. So we look very closely at the international legal arrangements that you mentioned, the World Trade Organization, the World Health Organization, partly as well. It doesn't have much power at all, but what we
It did
but
in
in the
2020
European,
though, didn't it? It definitely had it at certain moments. Am I right?
what it could do is it could make a pronouncement. It could say, look, we declare a pandemic, right? And then it could say we could recommend certain measures, but it couldn't force any government to do anything, right? So no government, the US government, there's nothing the World Health Organization could have done to force the US government to do anything. And so it's a bit different in the World Trade Organization, because in the World Trade Organization, the United States and other governments have actually taken on legal commitments in the past when they thought that benefited them. Like, for example, to give one example, the World Trade Organization has an agreement called the TRIPS Agreement on intellectual property rights, which helps to protect US property all over the world, right? And so that's something that the US government thought, Clinton thought, is really beneficial to US companies, like the pharma companies, the Hollywood, like everybody who produces intellectual property, again, like yourself, benefits from it being protected all over the world. But what happened over time is, like, the US took on some of these commitments, for example, to have very low tariffs when it was very competitive. And it's lost some of its competitiveness. And so now it's rethinking some of those commitments, particularly vis-a-vis China, right? And so it's not really the case that the World Trade Organization tells the US what to do. There's nobody in the World Trade Organization who can tell the US to do anything. It's really the governments getting together, negotiating agreements, and then sometimes they have second thoughts. And that's really, I think, the best way to describe the US relationship to the World Trade Organization, or the UK's relationship to the European Union, is they took on a bunch of commitments voluntarily, which involved ceding some freedom of action, and then they had second thoughts. So it's really not more devious than that. It's really, yes, sometimes you get it wrong. And the problem with law is, once you assume a commitment, it's enforced indefinitely. You can try to change it, of course, but that's really, I think, the basic story.
And so another reason why I think it opens up doors for problems is because the moment, like you said, yeah, the WHO really doesn't have too much control over a country. But if the WHO says, hey, we declare a pandemic, and then the government of the United States says, okay, whatever they say goes, and anybody who says anything against that is actually spreading misinformation, which means you do not belong on any social media platform. If you have a doctor's license and you're saying anything against the WHO, we're going to remove that license. And if you take any type of medication outside of what they recommend, we believe that is going against our policy, which could shut you down as a company. So that makes an individual's organization have control over a country if they're in bed together. Am I right? Do you see it the same way?
Well, I think that the fact that there's no direct power, you're absolutely right. I mean, the WHO, they have some power over discourse, right? Their recommendations are fought over, and they have to, but they have to get everyone on board. Like, they have to get a lot of people on board to be able to do that. And then you have that crucial mediating force, which is the US government, right? And so what you describe, which is essentially the sanction, the level of sanctioning that happens within a country, that is still, yes, of course, there's the backing of the international organization, but ultimately it's totally up to the US government to decide how to handle these issues. And that's why I think one of the problems sometimes with international organizations is they're really impotent, because they need everybody to be on board to do something important, right? So one reason the US got so frustrated with the World Trade Organization is because the World Trade Organization wasn't doing more to constrain, for example, China, right? That's not so much a problem of an overpowerful international organization. It's a problem of what from the US perspective is an impotent international organization. So in the way, the US would like to enlist these international organizations to constrain China more, and it just hasn't found that they are able to do it, and therefore it's decided to go it alone to some extent with regard to China.
In I think your first or second chapter, you have this thing called the elephant graph, and I was looking at it. It's from 1988 to 2008. Can you just explain what I'm looking at, or if anybody picks up the book, what they will see with this? I find this pretty interesting.
Absolutely. So the elephant graph was created by Branko Milanovic, who is an very famous economist of inequality. And what it shows the development of the relative growth of incomes over this period, 20-year period of high globalization from 1998 to 2008. And, sorry, 88 to 2008, right? And what it shows is that the curve that results has the shape of an elephant. And let's look at the different parts of the elephant. Well, the big part, the body of the elephant, is the Asian middle class, right? The Asian middle class has seen a very large growth in incomes over that period of globalization. And that's particularly, of course, China, and to a less extent, India, but also countries like Indonesia, Malaysia, but mostly it's the growth of the Chinese middle class. Then we see a dip where the trunk starts, and that's the working class in developed countries. And what the dip means is they have hardly seen a growth in their incomes over this period. So even though they're still much richer than the middle class in China in absolute terms, in relative terms, they've kind of lost out over this period. And then see the tip of the trunk, that's the global 1%, and they've also really benefited, right? And so the elephant graph can give us a picture of who wins and who loses from globalization. It's only one perspective, but one story is, well, the rich have really benefited, and the way they've benefited is in a way with just in alignment with the middle classes in the developing world by offshoring jobs to the developing world, particularly China. They've been able to produce in those countries. The good jobs have been lost in the developed world, but the beneficiaries are the workers in the developing countries who are getting all the jobs, and the owners of capital, the owners of the corporations who are at the top, at the tip of the trunk, and the losers are the workers in the developed world who've seen their jobs disappear. And that was very much Trump's story. He was saying he was focusing on the workers in the developing world who were gaining all these jobs, according to him, in Mexico and in China. Whereas someone like Bernie Sanders, he would focus on the top 1% and say, look, it's actually the US corporations who've made the decisions to move those jobs and who are also at the same time not paying their taxes. They are actually the ones who are the real winners and who are screwing everyone else. So the development, the elephant graph just represents a certain view of the facts. And then Trump and Sanders, they kind of spun different narratives around those facts.
Yeah, so what was it? Was it 19? Yeah, global income percentile went down to what was it? Almost zero in what was it at 80? I'm trying to read it here. So it's like percentage change in real income levels. Yeah, it skyrocketed, then it dropped down, and then it's coming right back. Pretty interesting. So, guys, if you open up his book, you'll see this elephant graph. It's a perfect explanation of what it looks like. It looks like a damn elephant. Another reason why I think many people who listen to this podcast or in my group say that globalization is a bad thing is because I believe they're focusing on equal outcome rather than equal opportunity. And so when you talk about who wins, who loses, I think who wins, I believe the elites and the establishment. Who loses? Anybody who has drive and maybe they want self-reliance. They don't want to be dependent on anybody. They want to create their own destiny, write their own chapter, if you will. So have you heard that? I guess you could say perspective that all we care about is equal opportunity. We don't care about equal outcome. And personally, there is no such thing as equal outcome, right? Everybody's different. If I give you $100,000 and you have no financial literacy, it'll be gone within a week. You give a rich person $100,000, it'll be $200,000 in a month. So is that something that you're able to maybe battle with and maybe have a rebuttal for?
Absolutely. I mean, there are you can actually tell the story about what you just said from the right and from the left. And that's really what we're trying to do in the book, is like take something like this, the problem that you just pose, and try to see how it looks from different sides, right? On the left, people would say, you're absolutely right, the economy is rigged, right? That's what people like Elizabeth Warren and Bernie Sanders say. And how is it rigged? Well, it's because the tax code, like if you're a millionaire, you're paying less in tax than your secretary, for example, right? The tax code favors the rich.
That's
It favors
percentage,
private equity
not less
companies.
overall. Yes.
Yes, exactly. Like in percentage terms, right? We have all these cases of private equity companies buying up perfectly sound companies, loading them up with debt, then essentially paying themselves huge management fees, and those companies ending up going bankrupt, right? And people losing their jobs, losing their pensions, and the private equity company comes out with a huge benefit. So that's the left wing perspective, right? The game is rigged, and I think that's the biggest message
That's
here.
Trump's perspective too, don't you think?
Well, Trump is, but he focuses, so both the Trump and the left, they are both railing against the elite,
Yes.
but they're faulting them for different things, right? So Trump tends to direct attention to some people, like to the outside to some extent, right? He just tends to say it's immigrants who are the problem. It's it's imports,
Illegal immigrants.
illegal
Right.
immigrants, right? It's imports it's foreign governments that are cheating, or foreign companies that are cheating, and he doesn't, to the same extent, direct attention to the domestic economic system, right? And so I think that's one of the differences that we identify between the critique from the right and the critique from the left. Is the left is really focused against the top 1% and domestic economic problems, whereas the right is somewhat more, Trump is tending to point attention to the outside, to the other, in a way, a bit more. But both agree that there's something fundamentally wrong with the current system, that's for sure.
Have you noticed that the top 1% across the board, the George Soroses, the Jeff Bezos, the Mark Zuckerbergs, they're all considered, in my opinion, globalists. Do you agree? And if that's the case, doesn't that sound a little bit in alignment with hypocrisy, where the richest, the true wealthy people, the richest people on the planet don't like Trump, right? And they love the Democrat Party and they love globalization. So is that, do you think it's a facade, or do you think they really believe it, or do you see anything wrong with that?
Well, I mean, they love globalization because they've done tremendously well from it, right? But I would actually say the group is a bit bigger, right? So it's not just the super rich who've benefited. It's people who have like the tech workers, right, or the college educated workers who the top 10%, because they are doing things that can reach a much broader market, right, due to globalization. So they all benefit from that, and that's, I think, brings me back to your earlier point about opportunities. Is yes, globalization opens up a lot of opportunities for those who can use it, but it also opens us up to more competition and to different types of injustices which we're not previously confronted with, right? So I think that, again, take your example, like due to globalization, we have access to cheap technology, you have access to a global market, like Spotify is a Swedish company, right? So you have you are able to, if you have talents, to scale them at a much greater level. But of course, you're also exposed to different pressures, different competitions that you wouldn't be if you adjust in a national market.
And I think that when it comes to globalization, maybe there's an equal playing field, hypothetically, right? That's where everybody's shooting for. Regulations, right? Don't destroy the environment. Everybody's playing by the same rules. However, I'm in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, and U.S. Steel was the biggest company in 1913, I think, up until the 20s. And it was just bought out by Nippon Steel from Japan. And it's because of the unions are different, regulations are different. Therefore, they're able to supply certain product at a much better price. And they probably don't have to play by the same rules, which allows them to go everywhere and maybe sell at a higher profit. So they bought out U.S. Steel. And when I look at the regulations that are in place across the world, some are playing completely different games, and they're never going to all agree on the same stuff. So globalization will only work if you kind of force people's hands and you say you're not allowed to do X, Y, and Z because this country said they're not going to do X, Y, and Z. And that is just impossible to implement when you're going against our enemies, right? These and our allies, maybe you can get NATO to do certain things, but talk about individuals who are in Iran or Iraq or, people call Russia our enemy. Do you think they're really going to agree to everything when it comes to globalization? I think that's the hardest part. Do you agree that getting everybody on the same page is absolutely impossible and pretty crazy to even think it could be done?
Well, that's actually one of the big, if you look at the big developments that have happened since this backlash against globalization, it's an attempt, it's two things. One is to decouple to some extent from our enemies, right? So from Russia, we have sanctions on Russia. Trump, of course, put in very high tariffs on products from China. It hasn't really worked to decouple, but in some areas, there's clearly decoupling between the US and China. But in other areas, there's a real attempt to do exactly what you described, to try to level the playing field. So one of the big innovations of NAFTA 2.0, which the Trump administration worked actually really closely with Democrats to put that in place, was to have a so-called rapid response mechanism for worker rights violations in Mexico. So if there's a complaint now in Mexico that at some company, some factory, worker rights are being violated, there's a very quick mechanism that kicks in, which allows then the US government to block shipments from that factory. And that's exactly this, and the Biden administration calls it the worker-centric trade policy, right? To really go in and make sure that, yes, of course, workers in Mexico are going to earn less because the standard of living is lower, but it shouldn't be because of violation of their right to bargain, right? And so that's something that increasingly you see in trade agreements. You see rules on the environment, you see rules on labor rights in order to try to level the playing field, at least to some extent. And in some contexts, like in the US, relationships with smaller developing countries such as Mexico, it's working. The US is able to get these commitments from those governments and to implement them. It doesn't work with India, it doesn't work with China, but it does work with other countries. And that's one of the big trends that we see in response to the backlash against globalization.
Gotcha. What got you to fall in love with this? I guess you could say this category, this type of information. Did you have a background in economics, or give us the rundown of how you got to where you're at now?
Sure. So I'm originally from Germany, and when I was in high school, I went to Brazil for a year as an exchange student, and it really opened my eyes. I learned about the factory that the German car plants like Volkswagen and Mercedes had there, how the workers were being treated. I learned about biopiracy, like corporations going into the Amazon forest, like taking out like learning from indigenous communities about the medicinal properties of all these plants and then patenting them and essentially getting all the benefits from it. And it really gave me a completely different perspective on globalization. Germany has lots of exports, and so we have a very gung-ho about globalization. Like we trade a lot. I'm from Hamburg, which is a big port. I always saw the container ships going in and going out. And so going to Brazil really changed my perspective and thought, okay, I need to learn more about this. I need to learn essentially how globalization looks from different sides. And so I studied international relations and then later international law, and particularly the World Trade Organization. In fact, I worked at the World Trade Organization for 2 years to really get an inside perspective on how globalization is governed. The point you mentioned at the beginning, like who is actually making the rules and are they legitimate? That was what drove me originally. And then when Trump came along and Brexit and the whole thing seemed to be blowing up, I really wanted to understand, okay, what are all the different critiques? How do they fit together? And also, how can we build alliances among different critics? And that's one of the most interesting thing about the NAFTA 2.0. It's called USMCA, US Canada, yeah. Is that it was really the Trump administration and the left-wing Democrats coming together and saying, well, we don't like the old establishment model of globalization, and we want to change it. And they came from different perspectives, but they had an awful lot to agree on. And one of the really interesting things, if you look at trade, there's actually not that huge difference between Democrats and Republicans in the US, right? Biden continued almost all the trade policies that Trump had, all the tariffs on China. Like Catherine Tai, the US trade representative, was confirmed unanimously in the US Senate. Like did you last have a unanimous vote in the US Senate, right? On trade, there seems to be this alignment between the left-wing critics of globalization and the right-wing critics. And that's one of the really interesting aspects among all the polarization that we're seeing in the US. that seems to be one of the areas where both parties really agree, essentially.
One last statement on globalization that I think is important, and maybe there's a rebuttal that you have in place, but because I don't think you're actually pick a side in this. You kind of show all angles in your book. So when I think of globalization, I think of our country helping other countries, right? Giving other individuals money to protect their borders. Whenever technically our country's a mess, right? Unemployment levels, whether it's homeless levels, whether it's drug levels, the border is wide open. We're not saying don't help everybody. As a person who's not a big globalist at all, not even the slightest, I guess. Hey, we'll do that, but fix our country first, which means become self-reliant when it comes to fuel, when it comes to energy, when it comes to our people. Make sure our country's safe, secure, happy, protected, right? And then whatever we can do, let's help other people. So that's what a government's for, right? To protect our rights, to take care of our borders. And to go against that is pretty much treason, in my opinion. So we're not saying don't help countries. It's like we'll help people whenever we're fixed. And so, what do you say to people like me?
Well, I mean, foreign aid is really not a big part of the globalized, what's usually referred to as globalization. That's kind of foreign policy. So essentially, the U.S. government gives foreign aid like for political reasons or also for humanitarian reasons, but not really for economic reasons. But I think the big question is like, how do you best protect your rights? And so, how do you? Because what is ultimately at stake is it's prosperity, right? And how do you value prosperity against other things like community? And that's one of the big things. Like I don't think the people in the 90s who are opening up the US economy in the 80s and 90s were really badly intentioned. I think they thought, well, US workers are super competitive, they're super productive. They're gonna outcompete many. I mean, many presidents said that. Plus, at the same time, we are going to get access to cheaper production. I mean, there's so many. If the US tried to produce everything that it uses itself, and as an entrepreneur, right? If you tried to do everything yourself, you would be spending all your time like growing your own vegetables. You wouldn't be able to make money, right? And it's the same at the international level. Like the US is very competitive in some areas. In others, others are better. Like with coffee growing, it's better to import. But even with cheap electronics, we may be better off putting our human resources in other things like producing movies, producing high tech, than having people in factories manufacturing cheap electronics, right? So it's really a question of okay, what kind of division of labor do we want, and which one is most beneficial to the United States? And the approach in the 90s was very much to say laissez-faire, like we'll let the market decide, and we're not going to interfere. And I think that's the big change that's now happening, is that both the Republicans and the Democrats are saying, no, we need to look more closely at what we want to be able to produce and what we can still import. And I think that's actually a very healthy change. And so to say the US government now says, okay, we need to have semiconductor production. So Biden passed the CHIPS Act, which is investing huge billions of dollars in US semiconductor production. Both Trump and Biden are saying we need to keep the car industry. But I don't think self-reliance can be approached to everything, because if you had to produce everything, it would overtax your resources. You really want to focus on strategic goods that are delivering the most value added and that are the most attractive types of employment. I mean, one thing that we're finding is that people don't like factory work that much. Like, well, of course, some people who've had good jobs in a GM plant, they really like that, but it's sometimes hard to attract people to like textile manufacturing and stuff. So it's maybe not. I think the best approach is to really think strategically. Okay, what kind of industries do we really need for reasons of resilience, for reasons of strategic reasons, because we need the jobs, and in what kind of industries it's actually much better for us to import, because we'll be able to afford way more. Like it grows our income if we're able to, our real income, if we're able to import cheaply. And so, yeah, I think I wouldn't say that US past governments were kind of not concerned about Americans. And I think they just thought that was the best approach. And we're now learning that that's not really the case. And you see in both parties a realization that we have to change course. And I think that's a really interesting period. But it's also it's a positive development.
If they pick up your book today, what would be the one thing you want them to leave with?
I would like people to gain a better understanding of the perspective of people that don't agree with that at all. That's, I think, what we're trying to do. What we're trying to in the book is we take, for example, in my political background is not necessarily someone who is in the Trump camp, but what I try to do and my co-author tried to do in the book is we try to give the best possible reading of the Trump narrative, the most convincing, the most compelling version of that narrative. And we also try to do the same for the left-wing perspective. And so what we really would love someone to do who picks up the book and say, okay, what is the perspective that I'm least likely to agree with in this book of the 6 faces? And then read that and see whether there's something in it. Because that's really what we found in the book, is that no matter how much we were inclined to initially disagree or reject a perspective, once we really got into it, we found something in it. And I think that's a really important approach. Try to put yourself in the shoes of the other, of someone you typically disagree with, and try to see the world through their eyes, and then see whether you can take something away from that. It doesn't mean you have to kind of switch sides to their perspective, but see whether you can take something away and understand them a little better.
Nice. Yeah, I think that maybe I just have this representation that the globalists that I know in my community, in my network, seems like their life is a mess, and they think that in order to fix their life, you need to fix the world. Well, I'm a Dr. Jordan Peterson maniac, and he always says that it's either the world or you, and you better damn well pray that it's you, because you can't do much about the world. You can only do something about yourself. And I'm like, wow, that's so meaningful. That fix yourself, and then you can fix the world. So that's the way I look at it. And I think it's important to just have that stoic approach where the world is only a reflection of who you are. And if you look at the world and say, hey, you need to be all perfect and equal and all that for me to be happy, those people are going to be suffering for a long, long time. It's just the way I look at it. So outside of your own book, is there one that you recommend to our audience? Maybe that got you to fall in love with this path that you're on.
Well, one book that definitely inspired us as we were working on this is it's called The Righteous Mind, and it's trying to what it's trying to do is it's actually it's a psychologist who wrote it, and what he's trying to do is say that each of us has different moral taste buds, right? So we some of us are more we like equality more. Others like sanctity more, respect for authority. And so these are all like we're genuinely different in that way. Cultures are different, but also individuals are different in that way. And it's very much that really much inspired us to say, okay, well, we have to try to put ourselves into each other's shoes and not assume the worst about others. I mean, I think that's really like take a good faith approach. Yes, of course, there's some people who are not arguing in good faith, but assume that people are good, right? And that's what his name is Jonathan Haidt. What he shows in the book is that good people can have fundamental moral disagreements. One reason being that they have these different moral taste buds, the different things that they value. And that's also something that we are, like a lesson we tried to take away for the book, is that in our discipline, international economic lawyers, international economists, it was very common to dismiss Trump and say he's economically illiterate, he doesn't know what he's talking about, he's incoherent. And we said, well, it's not just about facts, whether he got his facts straight. It's also about values. It's also about what you value. Like, is it really, are we willing to give up these manufacturing communities in order to gain access to cheaper products, for example, right? That's a value question at some level. And so that's, Jonathan Haidt was really an inspiration in taking this multi-perspective approach that we adopt in the book.
I like it. Never heard that. The Righteous Mind, I believe you said, right?
Righteous, yeah, The Righteous Mind.
It's
like the subtitle is like how good people can disagree about religion, politics, and so forth, right? And it's this premise that yes, even though they seem like your enemy, they're actually also good people, and we need to understand the reasons why we disagree.
Nice. So The Righteous Mind made me think of the Righteous Brothers, one of the best bands of all time. So yeah, I wrote that down. I'll check it out. Anyways, Nicholas Lamp, I really appreciate your time. Is there a website or a social media channel that people can find you on?
Well, I'm on Twitter, but also we have a website for the book called sixfacesofglobalization.com, where we collect all like reviews and our appearances and on podcasts and so forth. And so if you're interested in the book, that's a great way to start.
Wow, I'm looking at it right now. The best books of a certain year. You have a great list here, and it's very well done. So six, and that's spelled SIX, facesofglobalization.com. Check it out, guys. And he has it. It's a very nice website, very clean. Nicholas Lamp, thanks so much for being here, man.
My pleasure. Thanks for having me.
Remember, guys, $1 million book will lead to $1 million life. Right on.